South, the Pinewood High School Incident, Chapter 4. The question itself wasn't what made Cassidy feel as though her heart would jump out of her chest. Rather, it was the way that Amber presented it that made her blood run cold. The cheerfully ignorant partygoer that was talking to her about personal faults a moment ago had seemingly did away with the pretenses and decided to be honest with her. It was a terrifying side of Amber that Cassidy had never witnessed before. The words of a person which seemed to want to pull her into a twisted world of danger she knew nothing about. The tense silence that interfered with their conversation maintained its unwanted presence until, at random, Amber burst into an uncomfortable laughter. "Oh, God, have you ever killed someone?" she mocked while almost choking on her sarcasm. "You thought I was serious, didn't you, Tum Tum?" "Okay, Amber. Good night," Cassidy said as she hung up, her mind stuck on how guilty her best friend sounded. For the remainder of the night and the following morning, Cassidy remained trapped in her thoughts about what was said by Amber. It was terrifying to think that, for as long as the two of them had been friends, that a horrible secret had been kept, something that had the potential to change their entire lives at the very least. As she went to rebandage her arm as normal, she looked on at it in a sort of disbelief. Even as she was told that her wound was healing faster than a typical patient, she noticed that her arm was lacking any noticeable pain. Upon further inspection, she found little trace of the wound other than the moderate scarring that she assumed would take at least another few months to be. "What is happening to me?" she thought to herself as she stared at the marvel of modern medicine. Going throughout the rest of her day was a matter of procedure until, when she was finished her preps, she was called again by her deceptive friend, this time claiming to be bearing gifts of food for their meal preps. The girls went along with meeting up as planned, the conversations between them remaining light and unfulfilling the remainder of the day. When the time drew near for Amber to leave, the girl had an ulterior motion to present, something that Cassidy had suspected since noticing how much the girl was bringing up her sister. "It'll just be for tonight," the innocent Amber said with a light smile. "Kimberly's mad at me for not coming home again." It wasn't like she was going to say no to her, but something in Cassidy's gut was against the request. She still felt the dishonesty of the last conversation hovering over their relationship, like an oppressive pillar of clouds, drenching their fire of kinship with dampening distrust. Amber got the clearance to spend the night with Cassidy from her mother, and the girls made themselves comfortable on the front room couch. As they were about midway through one of their movies, Arthur approached them from the kitchen. "Hey, I'll catch you later, Cass. I'm going out," Arthur continued to walk as he spoke. "Is Mom in bed?" Cassidy stopped him. "She's good. Just don't be loud." Arthur spoke from the hallway where he was grabbing his keys. "Good night." "Good night, babe," Amber added, doing her best to endure the daggers that Cassidy was staring into her. When the girls heard Arthur shut the front door, Amber forced herself closer to Cassidy to cuddle. Cassidy allowed it and continued to watch the movie to its conclusion. Once it was over, Cassidy took a look at the time and saw that it was later than she thought. It was almost midnight, and she knew how Amber liked to sleep past alarms. Cassidy turned off the TV and forced the drowsy Amber up the stairs to brush her teeth and get into her bed. As Cassidy got in the bed with Amber and closed her eyes, however, her best friend wanted to be extra clingy and wrap herself around Cassidy's larger frame. "What are you doing, Amber?" Cassidy said as she sheepishly tried to shove the girl off of her. Amber didn't let go of her, Instead, she made herself eye level with Cassidy and maintained a deep stare on her for an uncomfortable amount of time. The two continued to stare at each other, Cassidy looking bewildered at the standoff, and Amber looking as though she were testing something between them. When what seemed like a few minutes had passed, Cassidy's eyes widened as her best friend kissed her on the lips. Amber. Cassidy tried to pull away, but was stopped by Amber, grabbing the back of her head. No. Shut up, okay? Amber demanded. Just close your eyes. Cassidy began to tremble as Amber continued to kiss and caress her. She didn't like what was happening to her, but she wondered what she could say to Amber to get her to stop. She tried to rationalize the situation by thinking about how much distance she had been putting between them over the last few weeks, and how Amber must have been frustrated with it all, about the lie she told to her about not going to the Coven's meeting. She assumed that what was happening to her was her punishment for not listening to her friend, and wondered if she should let it continue. When she felt Amber's fingers touching her where she didn't want, however, she grabbed her and pulled away. Amber, stop, she said with a louder tone. I said no. I don't want this. And what do you want? Amber challenged. I keep trying to bring you out of that little shell of yours. I give you all the chances in the world to stop feeling like the creepy little freak you are. And for what? Freak? Cassidy didn't hold back. Okay, Amber. I think you should go now. Cassidy watched Amber's expression shoot from one of judgment to a look of regret as the trespasser, that was supposed to have been her best friend, tried to take back what she said. As much as the girl tried to apologize and plead for forgiveness, Amber's efforts fell on Cassidy's deaf ears. As she stood up and prepared to expel Amber from the house by force, however, Cassidy caught a spark of the pain that Amber was in, being cued into how much her best friend was suffering by how honest her crying was. Amber, tell me what's wrong, Cassidy said, a little louder. What's gotten into you? I wasn't thinking when I... It was as if Amber swallowed something and couldn't articulate her words. I took it too far, Cassidy, and I'm sorry. Please, don't kick me out. Monday morning, when they got to school, Cassidy and Amber separated from each other without speaking, each giving the other a light hug before going their own way. When lunchtime arrived, Cassidy waited for her best friend as usual, but, unsurprisingly, Amber was nowhere to be found. After eating her food alone, Cassidy left the lunchroom early as usual and began to walk the halls. She found herself thinking about how close she had come to being assaulted by someone she trusted up to that point, and had to take a break in the bathroom. As she drew closer to the library to continue her brooding, however, an argument caught her attention on the sophomore hall that radiated with a familiar voice. And that's what modern slavery is, a lack of awareness to the oppression of your betters, Lydia preached. That's something I thought your people familiar with best. Excuse me? A younger voice mounted a defense. You think that we're all roped into the same group because we look the same? Typical academia at its finest. The two women continued their disagreement for what had seemed a long enough time, going back and forth about women's rights and staggering statistics that the younger woman seemed to dismiss as easily as swatting a fly. When it had seemed as though their argument was coming to an end, Cassidy decided to step away, but didn't manage to get far. Before she could take another step, Hadley's stern voice froze her in place. I see you, Cassidy, her teacher dictated. Come here. Cassidy decided to put her surprise of Lydia's intense sensory abilities aside to do as she was commanded. Walking from around the corner to see the familiar petite frame of Miss Hadley standing slightly taller than the thicker framed woman she was having her exchange with. The woman was wearing a janitor's outfit over her flawless brown skin, accented by very long braids that Cassidy could have sworn would touch the floor if not properly tied. There was a quick silence as she walked to her teacher's side and stood uncertain as to if she should be there. When the few seconds of peace were over, the two women decided that their war should continue, this time with collateral at stake in the form of a teenage girl. Take a look at who we do this for, Lydia said as she instantly put Cassidy as her main assault. She was depressed and suicidal before my girls found her. I agree that we need to keep a better watch on our girls, the janitor began, but we can't blame external factors like men every time we break a nail. We are perpetrating an unnecessary divide in our country's culture. Our country? Lydia copied her opponent. Every problem that has ever happened in our country has occurred because of men and weak women like you, slaves of your own ignorance. Wake up. Cassidy cringed as she listened to the two women go on about their viewpoints, their voices carrying through the halls as if wanting to gather an audience by volition alone. When both parties to the debate reached their resolve to stand against each other, the janitor tossed her hands at Lydia as a sign of dismissal and made her way from them with a cool pace. When the janitor was out of sight, Lydia turned her ire towards Cassidy, her body reminding her of the assault from the other night by making her flinch sharply. Instead of striking her, however, Miss Hadley walked up to her and gave her an unexpected hug. I know that arguments can be traumatic, and I apologize for bringing you in on that, the woman said as her black hair tickled Cassidy's nose a little. I wanted you to see how blind some women can be. You think I'm blind? Cassidy forgot to filter herself. Miss Hadley looked at her with a questioning look before remembering their last interaction and took a step back from her. Lydia seemed to ponder something before returning to their conversation and maintained a straight face while talking to her, as if they were in a poker match. Cassidy could feel how hesitant Miss Hadley was being and how she gave her responses, and wondered if she was trying to keep something from her, some small detail that could unravel a building lie. You need to focus on what's more important, Cassidy, Lydia said as she went for the door to her classroom. Have you come to a decision? Yes, ma'am, Cassidy answered with her head lowered. Lydia grabbed Cassidy's chin and raised her head to meet her gaze. As she did, however, the woman did another inspection of the girl's stature. After a moment of excessive staring, she let go of her head and grabbed her arm again. Cassidy wanted to fight the sudden action, but she relented and let Lydia continue. For a split second, Cassidy thought that she caught the woman represent surprise at the scar on her arm. Before it could be confirmed, though, her arm was released and Miss Hadley refocused herself. If you're going to say what I hope you are, there is one thing you'll do well to remember, Cass. Lydia's scowling made Cassidy want to leave the school early. My daughters apply the craft to their everyday lives to deter what might dare try to stop them. Are you prepared to do the same? The time for Mr. Bradley's class arrived, and sitting across from Cassidy, possibly to intimidate her, was Brittany, her fierce brown eyes trying their hardest to bore into Cassidy's skull. As the class continued, Cassidy would give glances over to see if the mad girl was still continuing her silent assault on her. She maintained a long and unwavering gaze that began to make Cassidy feel as though she would need to say something in order to escape the room with her health intact. About midway through the class, Brittany got up from her seat and walked over towards Cassidy, which sent her heartbeat into overdrive. Instead of a painful confrontation, however, she was presented with a hastily written note. As per the request of the sender of the note, Cassidy waited until after Brittany left for the bathroom to make the same request. On the main hall that led to the school's front entrance, she walked to her destination, the echoes of her footsteps reminding her that there was no one near that would be able to help her if something were to happen. When she reached the door to the girls' bathroom, she paused before entering. It was worrying to think that Brittany, of all people, would want to talk to her, but she was also very curious. That part of her that kept getting her into messes was another thing she pondered as she pushed the door open. Inside the girls' bathroom, leaning against the sink furthest from the entrance, was Brittany, her mind seemingly on many different things. When the door had finally closed behind Cassidy, Brittany pushed off from the sink and began her approach. The way in which the girl confidently stepped towards her made Cassidy drop her guard long enough for Brittany to get the upper hand, grabbing her by her shirt's collar and forcing her against the wall near the sinks. In a panic, Cassidy struggled against the strong girl that held her, staring at her with a confused look on her face. After her assessment was complete, Brittany let go of Cassidy and let her regain her composure before addressing her as if nothing happened. "I need your help with something," Brittany spoke as if it were normal that she would be doing so to Cassidy. "You know about the coven, right?" "What do you mean?" Cassidy didn't know how to respond. "I know that they've been talking to you," she said as she began to pace. "The Black Root Coven is the biggest group in the school, even though it only has a few girls in it. Do you know why?" Cassidy's eyes narrowed at the sudden thought. There were a lot of things being presented to her at the time, but she could never get a straight answer as to why they were so well known in the community. Even as she dealt with Amber, she was being told that the coven was active in other ways outside of the school, particularly with activism. As the wave of thoughts hit her, she lost track of Brittany, who had stopped her pacing and was looking at her direction. "I figured that they didn't tell you anything meaningful yet," Brittany smirked. "Don't worry, they're going to butter you up first before getting you to do the real stuff." "And what's that?" Cassidy wondered if she wanted to know the answer. "Our time is up," Brittany said as she stopped checking her phone. "Think about this, though. Who benefits most from having a bunch of activists in the school?" Brittany didn't waste any more time on Cassidy and left her to her thoughts after washing her hands. For a moment, Cassidy wondered if she should say something to the other girls about what had happened. But then she remembered the question. She thought hard about who could want the trouble of having an activist group housed within a corporate-controlled institution like Pinewood High. There would be too many headaches having to explain away the extreme actions taken by such a group. She remembered hearing from some famous insiders a popular saying, "Any press is good press." But she couldn't see how that could work with so many other oversights when dealing with children, particularly the parents of those students. The time came for the coven's next meeting, and as Cassidy made her way to the library, she was approached by none other than Jessica. The taller girl rushed to her and hugged her before giving her a once-over. She seemed to be concerned about something, maybe the way that Cassidy's face was fixed, but before she could make an excuse, Jessica cast a smile that made her feel warm. Do you want to talk about it? Jessica asked as the girls made it to the entrance of the library. Jess, Cassidy hesitated. I used to be a Christian, you know? Oh, yeah? Jessica seemed to trail off. Let me guess. Your mom and dad made you go to church. It's the same for most of us. We never get the chance to figure out life on our own. We're just told to be, and what? We're supposed to just be okay with that? Jessica seemed to be getting upset with the conversation, something that Cassidy didn't want to happen, but figured that it was unavoidable. She couldn't blame Jessica for her outburst either, her mind taking her back to how she felt when constantly being forced to sit in on Bible study lessons or singing in the choir. It was as if she were born into a world where she had no autonomy, where every decision, including her future, was set in stone. The frown that she'd gotten from Amber, and now Jessica, reminded her that she was holding on to something she felt she shouldn't be, but couldn't shake. You're right, Jessica, Cassidy said as she followed her into the library. This is my choice. After the evocation, the coven maintained their usual chatter and discussions before Lydia entered the circle. It was a usual affair. The discussion that day was on how women need to focus on their body health as well as their connections to the earth energies. As Lydia made mention of a few resources and guides presented by MCIS, however, she made mention of something else. Should you girls decide to attend the protest next month, make sure that you get with Tara to coordinate the banners and chants, Lydia said as she sat down. Also, if you're going to cast any spells, make sure to have Penelope help you with your wards. It was the second time she was exposed to the idea of being an activist that day, and the question planted by her nemesis from earlier sprouted in her mind again. Cassidy looked on at the girls as they laughed and bonded, showing their grimoires and charms, and fought with that feeling within her. Her stomach felt tight, and she wanted to excuse herself. But before she could, Lydia called her name. Are you ready, girl? The older woman said, with such a youthful smile that Cassidy felt as though they needed to confirm her age. Cassidy said as she stood. Yes. Yes, mother. She felt unsafe, the gathering of the girls serving to seal her within the influence of their leader, as the older woman raised her arms to an unknown power. Words she didn't understand filled the space, as each of the gathered witnesses chanted in unison, asking spiritual influences to enter and bless the initiate. She closed her eyes and, like she had felt before, a heat filled her and made her begin to feel dizzy, the chanting reaching a crescendo as Lydia stepped into the circle. She stood in front of Cassidy and commanded her to raise her arms. Of the gathered elements carried by the four winds, speak your intention, daughter of Hadley. Lydia's vanilla bean scent carried her tone. To join my sisters around the fire, Cassidy spoke the given words. To warm the bodies of the cold and dead. To burn away the pain of the past. Let fire consume you, my daughter, Lydia praised as she sprinkled water or something on Cassidy. Join your sisters in the powers of this universe. Be united as sisters by blood, by nature, by spirit. After closing their joining ritual, Cassidy was greeted by the collective of beautiful witches. each of them bearing gifts of hugs and congratulatory smiles. The whole affair made her feel as though she were truly a part of something spectacular and taboo, a sort of surrogate family providing her with the only thing she felt as though was taken when her father passed away. After the girls had their turn with her, Lydia embraced her with a final word. "You're one of us now, Cassidy." Lydia's embrace felt stiffer than the others. "Come to me if you need anything. You're my daughter now, after all." The next morning, Cassidy awoke to the best feeling she had ever had. She felt light and unbound, the sort of feeling she imagined that a character in a love story would feel if they were given the kiss from their crush. She smiled as she looked out of her single bedroom window and affirmed her feelings to the universe. She felt was blessing her with a lighter load than she was carrying before. She danced to the bathroom and washed as she had done countless times, her smile shining through her efforts as she finished her routine by staring at herself in the mirror. She was different, changed in some way that made her feel more alive than she ever had. "Cass!" A dark hand from the abyss grabbed her shoulder. Her eyes darted open as she nearly leapt from her bed. She was cold and sweating, her body trembling as she touched the spot where she was grabbed. Her breathing was short and labored as she pressed her back against the headboard of her bed. The sun hadn't completely come up, and the room was still enveloped in darkness, the very dark corners serving to oppress her psyche. It had felt so real, its searing hand violating her soul as it pleased. Her body shivered as she staggered to her bathroom, each step feeling as though she was being watched by something hidden. When she washed herself and examined where she was assaulted, however, there wasn't a visible mark or print to be found. The visceral chill that permeated the remainder of her morning had made her cautious of every interaction, simple actions taking a greater effort to accomplish due to the constant oversight of whatever had decided to visit her that night. As she got to school and listened to Miss Gale talk of writing assignments, she pondered if it was too late to repent for her sin. Once her first class was over, Cassidy made her way to the senior hall for her home room, but was suddenly found by none other than Amber. She looked as though she hadn't been asleep yet, the bags under her eyes serving to reveal her mental state. The two didn't hug, only they stared at each other as if there was a war going on and they were the opposing forces. Amber gave a greeting to Cassidy that had seemed to take a good amount of energy from her social battery. She returned the greeting with an attempt to hug her, but Amber took a step back, away from her, as if Cassidy were about to hit her. "Amber?" Concern mounted in Cassidy's voice. "What happened to you?" "I'll be honest with you now, Cassidy," Amber said as she grabbed her arm timidly. At first, Amber was looking at the floor, the way a child would if they were suddenly made to apologize for misbehavior. Her blonde hair had become stringy, opposed to the way she normally kept up with its care, and her voice was weakened and uncertain. She had looked as though she were a wounded house pet that had barely survived an encounter with a wild predator. As she spoke, Cassidy felt her shoulder grow warm. "I didn't just go to the party the other night." Amber's confessional began in a low tone. "Instead, I went to Chris's place, the guy from before. We hung out and he wanted to try stuff and I wasn't okay with it. Amber, why didn't you tell me sooner?" Cassidy tried to control her voice while massaging her shoulder. Did he hurt you? No, no, I was okay. But she held herself tighter. I stabbed him. I don't know if he's dead or. Amber failed at holding her tears back and fell onto Cassidy, expecting to be coddled. Cassidy tried to give her what she had wanted, but the heat in her shoulder began to get uncomfortable, to the point where she had to push Amber off of her as gently as she could. Amber, through her tears, tried to comfort her, but was suddenly still. Her body paused in the moment as if time forbade them from continuing their interaction. She didn't hear it, rather, she felt the vibrations of the same loud noise that had caused that kid in her class to bleed from the nose. A split moment later, and Cassidy was cast into the abyss, the same pit from which she assumed the demon that grabbed her was from. In that moment, she felt light, adrift on the singular sound that sent her to the void. Time didn't exist where she was. The motions of space were still as she cascaded through the infinite. She wanted to grab something, anything that would allow her to orient herself, but she was unable to focus. The pulsing nature of the tone seemed to come from every angle and bore its way into her bones. As the torture continued, she tried to call out to Amber, and her body suddenly became hot. It was a burning fire that caused her to scream and attempt to thrash against the darkness. But there was nothing to hit, only she was hitting something. It felt soft at first, the sort of thing a person would hit against in a gym, but with a distinct flesh-like texture. As she continued, Cassidy couldn't hear anything else over the oppressive hum of the tone, but she could feel herself screaming to the point of damaging her throat, the tinge of metal registering on her tongue. As fast as her intermittent blackout occurred, Cassidy's vision began to return in shades of red. She was breathing heavily. Her pulse raced with the intensity of one she could only imagine would be feeling during a heart attack. The heat generating from her body was hurting her so much that she feared that she was on fire as she began to regain her awareness of her body. She could still hear the tone weighing on her mind as she felt her body maintaining a punching motion. After what had seemed like too long of a time, the tone began to lessen, and she could hear her fists hitting against something wet. Her heart sank as she began to see past the red, to notice the outline of a petite frame, sprawled out on the ground beneath her. No, Cassidy couldn't say. God, please, no. Cassidy came to just as she was about to slam her fist into the skull of the familiar girl she was positioned over. Her entire body was aflame. Her skin felt as though she was placed in an oven to broil into nothing. She wanted to move, but the pain from burst blood vessels sent pins and needles throughout every part of her. Her face continued to twitch as she fought to control her focus in order to see fully what she had done. When her world came into focus, she looked at her hands first and then to the floor of the school. There, in a puddle of blood that was escaping from her head, was Amber. Her nearly unrecognizable face was contorted into a mess of swollen pulp and bruises. Cassidy tried to scream, but her voice was shot, her feeble attempt only resulting in short and raspy pants. She looked at her hands and began to cry, as she could see no other detail on them but her best friend's blood. Despite the pain in her throat, Cassidy began to wail as best she could in hopes that someone would come to rescue her. It took nearly 5 minutes for the sound of feet rushing towards her before she felt comfortable enough to pass out.